Father, please help. I am dying.
I'm here for you. You will be fine.
Father, please help. I am dying.
I'm here for you. You will be fine.
Blood reveals the stains that loyalty tries to hide. When the glass shattered at the Seoul Peace Gala, it wasn't the explosion that leveled the Lee Empire. It was the silence of a betrayal. While the high-ranking lieutenants of the city's most feared syndicate fled for the exits, leaving their leader's only child in the line of fire, a teenage girl, regarded by all as a fragile princess, became the only shield standing between a king and his grave. She didn't do it because she was trained. She didn't do it for the business. She did it because a legacy isn't inherited through a last name, but through the courage to bleed for it. Tonight, Lee Dong-hyun, a man who rules with an iron fist, is about to face a truth that no amount of violence can bury. He is about to discover that the heart of his empire isn't his throne, but the warrior he tried to keep in a cage. If this revelation leaves you breathless, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories of power and redemption. The Seoul skyline glittered like a spilled chest of diamonds, but from the penthouse of the Shilla Tower, Lee Dong-hyun only saw a grid of potential threats. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the silk of his tailored suit jacket catching the moonlight. In this city, his name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror. He was the ghost in the machine, the man who controlled the docks, the debt, and the shadows. Yet, as he turned away from the sprawling empire below, his expression softened into something almost unrecognizable. In the center of the sprawling white marble living room sat Jia. At 16, she was the living image of her late mother, possessing a quiet grace that seemed entirely alien to the world of blood and iron her father inhabited. She was focused intently on her cello, the deep, melancholic notes of Bach echoing through the glass palace Dong-hyun had built for her. To the world, this penthouse was a symbol of ultimate status. To Dong-hyun, it was a fortress. He had spent a decade refining the art of the lie, ensuring that Jia lived in a curated reality. She knew him as a powerful logistics mogul, a man of commerce and meetings, never seeing the red on his knuckles or the cold calculations made in the soundproof backrooms of Gangnam. "You're playing beautifully, Jia," Dong-hyun said, stepping into the light. Jia stopped, a small, playful smile tugging at her lips. "You're home early, Appa. Did the logistics meeting end ahead of schedule? The world moves fast, but never fast enough to miss your practice," he lied smoothly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of black hair behind her ear. His hand, which had signed death warrants only hours prior, was infinitely gentle. He had surrounded her with the best tutors, the rarest instruments, and a security detail disguised as valets and chauffeurs. He wanted her hands to stay soft, her conscience to remain clear. He believed that if he piled enough wealth and distance between her and the syndicate, the darkness would never find her. He treated her like a piece of ancient porcelain, precious, breathtaking, and terrifyingly easy to shatter. "Tomorrow is the Peace Gala," Jia reminded him, her eyes bright with innocent excitement. "You promised I could attend. You said it was a new chapter for the company." Dong-hyun hesitated. The gala was a den of wolves, a gathering of rival families to sign a precarious treaty. But looking at her, he saw only the need to reward her patience. "Yes," he murmured, a rare sense of foreboding rippling beneath his calm exterior. "A new chapter. I'll have the dress delivered by morning." He didn't realize that by keeping her in a palace of glass, he had made her the most visible target in Seoul. He thought he was protecting her innocence, never suspecting that the girl playing the cello had already begun to sense the rot hiding beneath the floorboards of his empire. The grand ballroom of the Lotte Hotel was a symphony of crystal and lies. Dong-hyun moved through the crowd of suited vipers, his presence a silent command that parted the room like a blade. At his side, Jia was a vision of unintended consequence, wearing a deep green dress that made her look far too much like the mother she had lost. He watched her from the corner of his eye, noting her polite smiles to men who would gladly see her father's head on a spike. For a moment, he let himself believe the peace treaty was real. The silence came first, a sudden, unnatural vacuum of sound as the music cut out. Then, the world turned inside out. The explosion didn't just shake the building, it tore the heartbeat out of the night. Chandelier crystals rained down like jagged diamonds, and the smell of ozone and C4 instantly replaced the scent of expensive lilies. Ji-ah! Donghyun roared, his voice barely audible over the secondary rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire. Panic was a wildfire. His elite guards, the men he had paid a king's ransom to be her shadows, were nowhere to be seen. The smoke was a thick, choking veil of gray and sulfur. Donghyun drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the chaos with a predator's focus, pushing through the stampede of fleeing socialites. He found her outside, near the line of idling luxury SUVs that were supposed to be their escape. The sight stopped his breath. The glass palace hadn't just shattered, it had been ground into dust. Jia was on the pavement, her back pressed against the cold metal of a black SUV. Donghyun dropped to his knees, his expensive suit dragging through the grit as he gathered her into his arms. Jia! Look at me. His voice was a raw, panicked jagged edge. She looked small, her pale skin stark against the dark green of her dress. Her eyes were wide, dazed, and swimming in shock. His gaze drifted to her upper arm, where blood soaked through the fabric, bright and terrifying. He gripped her shoulder, his hands trembling, a sensation he hadn't felt in 20 years. Behind him, his remaining bodyguards scrambled, phones pressed to ears, eyes scanning the perimeter for a second wave. Appa, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. He cradled her head, his protective rage boiling into something cold and lethal. He thought he was looking at her blood. He thought he was looking at his failure. He stared at the red staining her small, trembling hands, his mind already calculating the price he would make the world pay for this. But as he pulled her closer, his eyes narrowed. The pattern of the spray, the heat of the liquid, it didn't match the shallow scratch on her arm. The monster used to being in control looked at his daughter and felt the first shiver of a terrifying new reality. The blood wasn't just hers. And as he looked into her half-closed eyes, he didn't see the victim he had raised. He saw a reflection of himself. The sterilization of the private medical wing felt like a cold slap against Donghyun's feverish skin. He stood outside the glass-paneled recovery room, his hands still stained with the drying copper of the night's events. He hadn't washed them. He couldn't. Every time he looked at his palms, he saw the moment his world had nearly tilted off its axis. Dr. Park, a man who had stitched up the Lee family's secrets for 3 decades, stepped out of the room, peeling off a pair of latex gloves. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes held a flicker of something Donghyun couldn't immediately decipher. The wound on her arm is superficial, Donghyun, Dr. Park began, his voice low enough to escape the ears of the sentries lining the hallway. A graze from a 9mm round. The shock was mostly from the concussive force of the blast. She'll have a scar, but she'll keep the limb. Donghyun let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since the ballroom exploded. And the rest of it? She was covered in it, Park. I felt the heat of it on her dress. The doctor hesitated, glancing back through the glass at Jia, who lay motionless under a white linen sheet. That is where the situation becomes complicated. I ran a rapid forensic sweep of the biological material on her clothing and skin. I thought perhaps it was yours, or perhaps one of your men's. And? Donghyun's voice took on the low, vibrating growl of a predator. It isn't yours. It belongs to a male, likely mid-30s, with a high concentration of adrenaline in his system at the time of expiration, Park said, leaning in closer. But more importantly, Dong-hyun, the arterial spray patterns on her dress aren't consistent with her being a bystander. The blood was projected from a distance of less than 2 feet. It was a direct hit to the carotid. Dong-hyun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. What are you saying? I'm saying that for that amount of blood to be on her in that specific pattern, she wasn't hiding behind that SUV, Dr. Park whispered. She was standing over the source. And based on the angle of the entry wound I found on the assassin they pulled from the bushes nearby, the one killed with his own tactical blade, whoever neutralized him knew exactly where the soft tissue met the spine. Dong-hyun looked through the glass. His porcelain daughter looked so small in the hospital bed, her dark hair fanned out like ink on the pillow. He had spent years ensuring she didn't know how to hold a knife, let alone how to find a man's life breath with one. She's a child, Dong-hyun said, though the words felt hollow in his throat. She's a Lee, the doctor corrected grimly. And someone taught her how to hunt. If I were you, I'd stop asking who attacked her, and start asking who she's been talking to when you aren't looking. The silence in the recovery room was heavy, vibrating with the unspoken questions that hung between father and daughter. Dong-hyun sat by the bedside, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the white tiles. He watched Jia's eyelashes flutter, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the sterile vacuum. When her eyes finally opened, they weren't filled with the tears of a frightened child. They were as clear and cold as winter ice. "Appa," she whispered, her voice raspy from the smoke she'd inhaled. Dong-hyun leaned forward, taking her hand. It felt delicate, but he couldn't stop looking at her fingernails, imagining the microscopic traces of the man she had ended. "I'm here, Jia. You're safe. The doctors, they say you'll be fine." "The hit wasn't meant for you," she said, ignoring his reassurances. Her gaze drifted to the door, where the silhouettes of his most trusted men stood guard. "They wanted the legacy. They wanted to hurt you by taking me, but they didn't count on the gate being left open." Dong-hyun's jaw tightened. "What are you saying?" "My security is the best in the country. No one gets through without a code." Jia turned her head toward him, a grim maturity settling over her features that made his heart ache. The codes didn't matter because the door was open from the inside. When the first explosion went off, everyone scrambled. But Min-ho, he didn't reach for his weapon. He reached for his phone. He sent a signal. Dong-hyun felt a surge of cold fury. Park Min-ho had been with the family for 8 years. He had driven Jia to her recitals, he had been the one to carry her bags and open her doors. He was the man Dong-hyun had hand-picked to be her primary shadow. "Are you certain?" Dong-hyun asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "I saw him, Appa. He stood by the SUVs and watched the assassin approach me. He didn't move. He just nodded, like he was giving permission." She closed her eyes for a moment, the memory vivid and sharp. "The man with the knife, he thought I was a trophy. Min-ho thought I would just scream. They were both wrong." Dong-hyun stood up slowly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. The betrayal was a physical weight, a poison that had entered his house under the guise of loyalty. He looked at his daughter, the girl he had tried to keep in a glass palace, and realized the glass hadn't just shattered, it had turned into a weapon. "Rest now, Jia," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "I will handle the rest." As he stepped out into the hallway, his eyes locked onto Min-ho, who stood at the end of the corridor, looking alert and dutiful. Dong-hyun didn't signal his guards. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, the predator finally emerging from the father's skin. The silent witness had spoken, and in the world of the Lee Syndicate, silence was a luxury the traitors were about to lose forever. The hospital corridor felt longer and colder than it had minutes before. Dong-hyun walked with a measured, rhythmic stride, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. Behind him, his primary lieutenant, Baek, struggled to maintain the pace. Dong-hyun didn't go to the elevator, he headed for the private security monitoring room at the end of the wing. "Lock the floor," Dong-hyun commanded, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp. "No one enters. No one leaves. And cut the external feeds." Baek hesitated for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat too long. "Sir, the council is waiting for an update on the gala attack. They're worried about." "The council can worry in the dark," Dong-hyun interrupted, turning to fix Baek with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "Right now, I am looking for a ghost. And ghosts usually hide in the shadows of men I pay to be my eyes." Inside the monitoring room, the screens flickered with blue light, casting eerie shadows across Dong-hyun's sharp features. He didn't look at the gala footage yet. Instead, he looked at the logs of the internal encrypted comms. He watched the timestamps. He watched the pings. Minho was still standing outside Jia's room, a sentinel of staged loyalty. Dong-hyun watched him through the security camera, seeing the way the man's hand hovered near his earpiece. Minho wasn't waiting for orders, he was waiting for a signal that the job was finished. "Bring the security team to the sub-basement." One by one, Dong-hyun said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Start with the junior guards. I want to see who flinches when I tell them the assassin lived long enough to talk." The silent purge began not with gunfire, but with the terrifying pressure of a man who had nothing left to lose. In the damp, concrete confines of the hospital's lower levels, Dong-hyun sat in a single chair, the light from a buzzing overhead bulb reflecting off his polished shoes. The first 3 guards were terrified, their loyalty proven by their sheer incompetence. But the 4th, a veteran named Cho, couldn't stop tapping his thumb against his thigh. It was a rhythmic, nervous habit, the same rhythm Jia had described when Minho signaled the SUVs. Dong-hyun didn't scream. He didn't even stand up. He simply leaned forward into the light, his face a mask of predatory calm. "Cho, I've known your father for 20 years. I gave your sister a scholarship. Tell me, how much did my brother promise you to look the other way while a blade was put to my daughter's throat?" Cho's face drained of color, his knees buckling before the truth was even uttered. The shadow in the ranks was longer than Dong-hyun had feared. It wasn't just a rogue guard, it was a rot that had reached the very roots of his family tree. As the first of the traitors was led away into the darkness, Dong-hyun realized that to save Jia, he would have to burn down the very empire he had built to protect her. The smell of expensive cigars and aged cognac usually signaled a celebration in the Lee family, but tonight, in the mahogany-lined study of the secondary estate, it smelled like a funeral. Lee Sang-hoon sat behind his brother's desk, his feet propped up on the edge of the hand-carved wood. He didn't look like a man whose niece had nearly been assassinated, he looked like a man who had finally stopped waiting for his turn to lead. The double doors swung open, and Dong-hyun entered, the aura of the hospital sub-basement still clinging to his heavy overcoat. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He simply watched his younger brother with eyes that had seen 1,000 betrayals, but none that cut quite this deep. "You're late, Dong-hyun," Sang-hoon said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I heard the gala was quite explosive. A tragedy, really. The peaceful transition we all hoped for, gone up in smoke." "The assassin is dead," Dong-hyun said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "And the men who opened the gates are being processed. They've started talking," Sang-hoon. It's amazing how quickly loyalty dissolves when the oxygen in the room starts to run out. Sang-hoon's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened into flint. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of a suit that was an exact, mocking replica of his brother's style. Then let's stop the theatrics. You've spent 20 years building a wall around that girl, thinking you could keep the mud of this business off her dress. But in doing so, you've made us weak. The Japanese syndicates are moving on the northern ports. The Russians are squeezing the digital laundries. And you're playing house with a cellist. He tossed a thick, leather-bound folder onto the desk. Inside were signed contracts, not with local allies, but with the very rivals Donghyun had spent a decade fighting. It was a total alliance, a surrender of the Lee sovereignty in exchange for Sang-hoon's installment as a puppet king. They don't want a father on the throne, Sang-hoon hissed, leaning over the desk until he was inches from Donghyun's face. They want a wolf. I've given them the keys to the city, brother. Your empire is already gone. All that's left is to decide what happens to the girl. If you step down tonight, I'll ensure she stays in her glass palace. If you don't. He trailed off, the threat hanging in the air like a poison mist. Donghyun looked down at the documents, then back at the man who shared his blood. He realized then that the brothers' gambit wasn't about power, it was about a deep-seated resentment of the love he showed Ji-ah. You think the crown makes the king, Donghyun said, his voice deathly quiet. But you've forgotten the most important rule of our bloodline, Sang-hoon. We don't negotiate with those who threaten our heart. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed her. Donghyun turned to leave, his silhouette a towering shadow against the gold-leafed walls. The war was no longer in the streets, it was in the marrow of his own bones. The safe house was a nondescript villa tucked into the jagged cliffs of Namhansan, a place designed to disappear into the fog. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence of the mountain was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of heavy boots on gravel. Inside, the power flickered once and died, plunging the reinforced living room into a tomb-like darkness. Ji-ah stood in the center of the room, her breath steady and shallow. The bandages on her arm were a stark white against the shadows, but she didn't feel the sting of the wound anymore. She felt the weight of the tactical blade she had pulled from the hidden compartment in her father's desk, the same blade she had used at the gala. A window shattered in the kitchen. Then another. They were coming from three sides, moving with the precision of professionals who expected to find a frightened girl hiding under a bed. The first man through the door didn't see her. He was looking for a victim, he found a shadow. Ji-ah moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, sliding beneath his guard and driving the hilt of the blade into the soft hinge of his jaw before twisting behind him. It wasn't the clumsy struggle of a teenager, it was the calculated economy of someone who had spent her nights watching her father's drills from the vents of the training halls, practicing the movements until they were etched into her bones. Clear the perimeter, a voice barked from the hallway, Minho's voice. The traitor was here to finish what he started. Ji-ah didn't wait. She kicked a heavy mahogany chair into the path of the next intruder and used the momentary distraction to scale the staircase, her movements silent as a ghost. From the landing, she looked down at the men she had once trusted to protect her. They looked like giants, but from her vantage point, they were merely targets. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a handful of industrial ball bearings she'd scavenged from the garage. She cast them across the marble floor just as the second wave rushed in. The sound of sliding leather and muffled curses filled the air. As they stumbled, Ji-ah didn't retreat. She dropped from the railing, her small frame landing with the impact of a falling star. By the time Donghyun's secondary strike team arrived, screeching into the driveway with tires smoking, they didn't find a massacre of the innocent. They found 3 of Sang-hoon's elite mercenaries neutralized on the floor, groaning in the dark. And in the center of the room, standing over a pinned and gasping Min-ho with the point of a blade resting against his throat, was Ji-ah. Her dress was torn, her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were twin fires of cold, focused resolve. When she looked up and saw her father's silhouette in the doorway, she didn't cry. She simply tightened her grip on the steel. "You're late, Appa," she said, echoing his own words back to him. The gate was open again. So I closed it. The drive back to the city was carved in a heavy, suffocating silence. Outside the armored glass of the SUV, the neon lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of synthetic violet and cold white, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and iron. Dong-hyun sat in the rear, his frame rigid, his eyes fixed not on the passing skyline, but on the girl sitting across from him. Ji-ah was cleaning her blade with a scrap of silk torn from her ruined dress. Her movements were methodical, lacking the frantic energy of a survivor and possessing instead the terrifying efficiency of a professional. She didn't look like the daughter who had played Bach in the Glass Palace only 48 hours ago. She looked like a soldier returning from a front she had been fighting on alone for years. Dong-hyun looked down at his own hands, then at the tailored sleeve of his suit. For a lifetime, he had worn this authority-like armor, believing that his power was a ceiling that would keep the world from crashing down on her. He had built high walls and filled them with beautiful things, thinking that if she never saw the dirt, she would never be soiled. "When did you learn?" he finally asked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "The drills. The pressure points. The way you held that knife, that wasn't luck, Ji-ah." Ji-ah didn't look up from her work. "You thought the vents in the training hall were soundproof, Appa. You thought that because you never spoke of the blood at the dinner table, I couldn't smell it on your skin when you kissed my forehead goodnight." She finally met his gaze, and the depth of her knowing hit him harder than the gallows blast. "You spent 16 years trying to keep me a child. But a child is just a victim waiting to happen in your world. I didn't want to be a victim. I wanted to be a Lee." A wave of profound, crushing guilt washed over Dong-hyun. He realized that his protection hadn't been an act of love, but an act of vanity. He had wanted to preserve a version of her that made him feel human, regardless of the fact that it left her defenseless against the wolves he knew were circling. His overprotection hadn't been a sanctuary, it had been a cage that nearly became her coffin. The suit he wore, the symbol of his status, suddenly felt unbearably heavy, a leaden weight of missed cues and arrogance. He had been so busy guarding the door that he hadn't noticed his daughter had already climbed out the window to learn how to survive the fall. "I thought I was saving you," he whispered. "You were saving a ghost, Appa," Ji-ah replied, sheathing the blade with a definitive click. "But the girl sitting in front of you is very much alive. And she's the only one who is going to help you take back your throne." Dong-hyun reached out, his hand hovering before finally resting on her shoulder. This time, he didn't feel the need to shield her. He felt the steady, unbreakable strength of a partner. The cage was open, and for the first time, they were both truly free. The rain over Incheon harbor wasn't a drizzle, it was a physical weight, a torrential downpour that turned the towering stacks of shipping containers into a rusted, iron labyrinth. This was the graveyard of the Lee family's rivals, the place where the tide washed away secrets and sins alike. Tonight, the docks were alive with the blue flicker of welding torches and the harsh glare of floodlights, illuminating the army Sang-hoon had gathered to finalize his coup. Dong-hyun stepped out of the black sedan, the water immediately drenching his hair and plastering his white dress shirt to his chest. He didn't carry an umbrella. He carried a heavy-caliber handgun and the terrifying calm of a man who had already accepted his own end. Beside him, Ji-ah was a shadow in a dark tactical jacket, her eyes scanning the crane lines and the high catwalks with a precision that chilled him. Stay behind the primary line, Jia, Donghyun commanded, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. No more cages, Appa, she replied, her hand resting on the hilt of the blade at her thigh. We walk in together, or we don't walk out at all. They moved into the heart of the shipyard, the rhythmic clang-clang of metal on metal signaling the start of the final showdown. The first ambush came from behind a stack of blue containers. Gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes illuminating the rain like strobes in a nightmare. Donghyun moved with a brutal, veteran grace, his shots finding their marks with clinical efficiency. But it was Jia who turned the tide. She moved through the environment like a phantom, scaling the iron service stairs with a speed that defied the slick surface, dropping from the heights to neutralize the snipers before they could find her father's heart. At the edge of the pier, standing before a massive cargo ship bound for international waters, was Sang-hoon. He was surrounded by the high-level executives of the rival syndicates, the men who had come to witness the crowning of a puppet. "You're a relic, Dong-hyun." Sang-hoon screamed over the wind, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and triumph. "Look at you. Drenched, bleeding, and dragging a child into a war zone. Is this your legacy?" Dong-hyun didn't stop walking until he was 10 paces away. The rain-slicked concrete was a stage for the final act. "I didn't drag her here, Sang-hoon. She's the only reason I'm still standing." The final battle was a blur of steel and salt spray. As Dong-hyun engaged his brother in a desperate, close-quarters struggle, the rival bosses moved to intervene. They were met by a girl they had dismissed as a princess. Jia moved between them, a whirlwind of redirected force and flashing silver. By the time the storm reached its peak, Sang-hoon was on his knees, and the allies he had bought with betrayal were realizing that the Lee bloodline didn't just rule the city, it owned the shadows within it. The metallic tang of the harbor air was thick enough to taste as Dong-hyun and Sang-hoon grappled on the edge of the pier. The brothers were a blur of wet wool and desperation, their silhouettes casting long, jagged shadows against the hull of the cargo ship. Sang-hoon, fueled by a lifetime of resentment, had managed to draw a hidden ceramic blade, the edge glinting with a lethal hunger. He drove Dong-hyun back toward the churning black water of the Incheon tide, his face twisted into a mask of pure, fratricidal hate. "It's over, Dong-hyun." Sang-hoon screamed, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. "The empire needs a king who isn't blinded by a daughter's ghost." Dong-hyun's foot slipped on the oil-slicked concrete. He felt the cold spray of the sea on his neck as he teetered on the brink. Sang-hoon raised the blade, his arm tensing for the final, downward arc that would sever the Lee bloodline in half. Dong-hyun closed his eyes, bracing for the steel, his only regret being that he hadn't given Jia a world that didn't require her to be a killer. The shot didn't sound like a movie, it was a sharp, mechanical crack that pierced through the roar of the gale. Sang-hoon's arm jerked back, the blade spinning into the abyss. He gasped, looking down at his shoulder where a blooming crimson flower had suddenly appeared on his pristine white shirt. 50 yards away, perched atop a stack of rusted iron containers, Jia stood perfectly still. She held a long-range tactical rifle with the steady, unblinking focus of a statue. The recoil hadn't moved her, the gravity of the moment hadn't shaken her. The rival bosses froze. In the underworld, power is often measured by the willingness to pull the trigger when blood is involved. By taking the shot that saved her father, Jia hadn't just ended the coup, she had signed her name in the blood and ink of the syndicate's history. Dong-hyun surged forward, disarming his stunned brother and pinning him to the rain-soaked ground. But he wasn't looking at Sang-hoon. He was looking up at the container. Jia lowered the rifle, her gaze meeting his through the downpour. There was no triumph in her expression, only a profound, somber acceptance of who she was. The survivors of the rival families backed away into the shadows, their silence a form of surrender. They had come to watch a father fall, instead, they had witnessed the birth of a successor. The glass palace was gone, replaced by a throne of iron and salt. As Jia climbed down to stand by her father's side, the transition was complete. She wasn't just the girl he protected anymore, she was the heir who protected the empire. The morning after the storm did not bring a peaceful sun, but a cold, gray clarity that settled over the Li estate. The glass palace was gone, its shattered windows boarded up, but the power that radiated from the penthouse had never been more palpable. In the grand courtyard below, the iron gates stood wide, admitting a procession of black sedans that stretched back toward the heart of Seoul. This was not a meeting for negotiation, it was a summons. The leaders of the allied families and the remnants of the broken council stood in silence, their breaths misting in the early air. They were men who only bowed to strength, and for years, they had whispered that Lee Donghyun had grown soft, distracted by the frailty of his daughter. They stood looking up at the wide stone balcony, waiting for a sign of who would lead them through the coming shadows. When the glass doors finally opened, Donghyun stepped out. He wore a fresh black suit, his movements carrying the heavy authority of a man who had stared into the abyss and survived. But he did not stand in the center. He stepped to the side, his hand extended behind him. Jia emerged, her presence commanding the air. She wore a tailored suit of deep charcoal, her arms still bandaged beneath the sleeve, her expression unreadable and ancient. She didn't look like a girl who had been rescued, she looked like the one who had done the saving. The silence in the courtyard deepened, a heavy, reverent weight, as the bosses recognized the cold steel in her eyes, the unmistakable mark of the Lee legacy. For too long, I believed that protection meant keeping the truth behind walls, Donghyun's voice boomed, carrying over the assembly without the need for a microphone. I thought a father's duty was to keep his child's hands clean. I was wrong. A father's duty is to ensure his heir is ready for the fire. He turned to Jia, his pride no longer a hidden secret but a public declaration. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, the syndicate saw them not as protector and protected, but as a singular, unbreakable front. The era of secrets is over, Jia added, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the morning chill. We do not rule by hiding. We rule by standing together. One by one, the leaders in the courtyard lowered their heads. It was a silent acknowledgement of the new dynasty. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, catching the light in Jia's eyes, the moral of the Li Empire was written in the stone of the city: blood may define a family, but loyalty and shared sacrifice define a throne. They had learned that a cage, no matter how beautiful, only breeds victims, but a partnership forged in the rain creates a power that can never be broken. The girl of glass was gone, the queen of iron had arrived.